So, as I mentioned, we are Family Caregivers of BC, and we are 100% dedicated to supporting unpaid family and friend caregivers. We've been around, this is our 30th year, and we were the first provincial organization in Canada. There are now 2 others, one in Alberta and one in Nova Scotia, and I think Ontario is also, they're getting one, so there will soon be 4. In British Columbia, we have been serving the whole province for the past 6 years with funding from the Ministry of Health. And we greatly appreciate that funding because it allows us to provide these webinars free across the province. We do a whole bunch of things, and as I said before, I'm really hoping that you will take the opportunity to go on our website because that really is our hub. You'll see the address for the website in the bottom of this slide, but just to make it really simple, we have 3 basic pillars in terms of what we do. And the first is caregiver support. So no matter where you live in British Columbia, you can call the toll-free number that you can see on this slide, 1-877-520-3267. And when you call that line during the week, Monday through Friday, 8:30 till 4, somebody will speak to you about what's going on for you. And it's invaluable. We hear all the time from caregivers saying how helpful it is to speak to someone who understands what they're going through, listens without judgment, and really can help them navigate and find resources that will be helpful for them. We also offer one-on-one caregiver coaching for situations that are really tricky. If you're going through a transition or you yourself are having healthcare problems as a caregiver, or you're just really finding it difficult, those kind of situations might require some follow-up, and that's what our caregiver coaching model allows for. We will also help you find support groups wherever they might exist in the province. And I should just qualify by saying that our services are not disease-specific. So we are non-disease-specific or on our website. If you go to the website and go under resources for family caregivers, you will find all kinds of resources on many, many different topics. Tonight we're bringing you a webinar, and I've already mentioned that we have recorded webinars on our website on, again, a variety of different topics. So I encourage you to go on and have a look around. And we are recording this webinar, so in about a week we will have this webinar posted on our website, along with the handout of the PowerPoint presentation that you'll be seeing. And we also attend and operate with the health sector. And if you're a caregiver who is going through the system and working with a team of care professionals, whether it's a GP, a nurse practitioner, nurses, care case managers in the home or in the hospital, we're reaching out to those folks to help them understand that we're here in British Columbia, and we're hoping that they will also help you by referring you to us for support. All right. We just want to make a point, we do this in our webinars, that you know, we are working hard at Family Caregivers of BC to make sure that information that family caregivers are interested in is being brought forward to them. So we're supporting inquiry processes wherever we can. And when we present a webinar, it isn't a suggestion that we're endorsing a particular product or opinion, but just really trying to make sure that caregivers are feeling supported. So that definitely goes for tonight's webinar. And as well, we always mention that webinar content is not intended to be any kind of substitute for professional medical advice. So we've gotten through the formalities, and now I get to introduce Roseanne. And it's with great pleasure that I'm introducing Roseanne, who is, has worked at Island Health here on Vancouver Island for quite a number of years. And she told me tonight that her practice was primarily in the community, so she really does understand what it's like to be a caregiver, caring for someone in the home. But then Roseanne went on to get her PhD, and she has embarked on really interesting research based on storytelling, which she has shared with me on different occasions. So she explores different topics by having people tell their stories and listening, and that makes her such a wonderful candidate for the job that she eventually has taken on as Island Health Clinical Lead on end of life when the medical assistance in dying legislation came into force. So I'm going to let Roseanne talk a little bit about that when she's presenting tonight. I'm just, again, very thrilled to have you here, Roseanne. And I just would like to point out that we have an article in our fall edition of our newsletter, which you can also find online, about medical assistance in dying from the perspective of a caregiver. So Roseanne, I'm going to now we're going to put Roseanne's presentation up now. Just before we get going, another reminder to please press *6 if you're calling in on a landline or a cell phone, because we can hear your background noise. So it's hard for everyone to hear. *6. Thank you so much. So Roseanne?
Great. Well, good evening, everybody. We're in this virtual classroom together, and it's an honor and a joy for me to be here with you. And thank you, Janet, for that introduction. So, as Janet mentioned, my name is Roseanne. I've been a nurse for many years and also associated with the university and with Island Health. And in the last 4.5 years, I've taken on the role of clinical nurse specialist with assisted dying, and that has been a privilege as well, just to hear stories and interact with people from across British Columbia, but mostly the island, of course, who are experiencing suffering at the end of their life. So Janet has asked me to be here today, and thank you for that. And I just wanted to acknowledge all of you on the phone and whatnot for what you are doing in your caregiver role. That is just so vital, the contribution that you make, and I hold you in the highest regard. So with the session tonight, Honoring Wishes, what I'll do is basically talk a little bit about legislation. I'll talk about eligibility, safeguards. I'll talk about process, realities, issues, share some stories, and talk about resources. And so it's an overview in a sense, because some of you will have more knowledge than others, and some of you will want more knowledge than others, but this will at least get us to a similar place. And then throughout, if people have questions, please let Janet know, and then she will just wave her hand, and you can stop and address questions in the moment so you don't have to hang on to them. So with that in mind, I'll just get started. So it's just legislation. So it was in June of 2016 that Bill C-14 was passed in Canada. So medical assistance in dying is now a legal option for persons at end of life. And actually what the Canadian government did is they amended the criminal code, and that makes it possible for physicians and nurse practitioners to offer this option for individuals who are suffering. So MAiD has been available around the world in other jurisdictions for many decades. What is rather unique about assisted dying in Canada is that we've called it medical assistance in dying, and the terminology was really specific because it captures the idea that Canadians have the choice of an oral option, and they also have the choice of an intravenous option. And say, for example, in the U.S., that wouldn't be true. It would only be an oral option. So we're one of the unique areas with both these choices. And I'll just mention, I know most of you are probably from Western Canada, but if anyone is from out east, Quebec has different legislation that was enacted a little sooner, but I'm not speaking specifically to that, but to the legislation that is across all of Canada. So just to step back a little bit about a really important time. Sorry, Janet, next slide.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, I'm looking at the little blue wall and not at the slide. So this is just what I reviewed, that the Criminal Code of Canada was amended. And so for the next slide, this just talks about an important time in Canadian history. And for those of you on the call that live on Vancouver Island, you might recall, believe it or not, it was 25 years ago that Sue Rodriguez was living with ALS on the island here, on the peninsula actually, and she took her concern to it actually went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and in 1993 asked for a ruling if she had the right to have an assisted death. And the ruling, there are always the 9 Supreme Court justices, and the ruling was 5-4. So it was a split decision. And when she came out of the courtroom, you can Google different videos and you'll see the disappointment that she faced. So the decision was in 1993, and in 1994, when she was 43 years old, she did have an assisted death, but to this day, that's never been revealed, and so that still remains a mystery. And in British Columbia, since then, we have others who have championed the idea of choice. One was Gloria Taylor, living with ALS, and she did receive an exemption to go ahead, but ended up dying of an infection before. And so the legislation we have in Canada actually came from the case of Kay Carter, who was a British Columbia woman with spinal stenosis, and she actually ended up going to Switzerland, but it was her daughter and son-in-law who took her case forward through the Supreme Court of Canada. And so at that time, so still 9 Supreme Justices. I think only one was the same from before, but of the 9, this time, the ruling was 9-0 in favor.
Wow.
So they ruled in favor of Kay Carter, and the decision was made that the federal government had to amend the criminal code, and that actually it was in violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights. So that's what happened. And so the next slide, this is just a picture of Sue Rodriguez, and when she came out of the courtroom, this is what she said: "If I cannot give consent to my own death, whose body is this? Who owns my life?" And I really think that about 25 years ago, she started a movement in Canada, and I think through all of time, that's been a real philosophical question that people have asked, like, what role do we get to play in our own deaths? And when you think back to Sue Rodriguez 25 years ago, so much has shifted in Canada since then, and so when the court ruled 9-0 in favor, you can see that just reflects the passage of time and a shift in views. So with the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit now about who is eligible. So for an assisted death, a person has to be eligible for health services in Canada. And the reason that was put in there is because we didn't want tourism, we didn't want death tourism, and it was just a new law in Canada, and we wanted to just understand that. So that was the reason that was put in, and of course the service is funded as well, so that's important. Secondly, a person has to be at least 18 years of age and capable of making decisions about their health, but specifically they have to be capable about making this decision. So we can talk more about that, but a person has to have capacity, and so it's not a full cognitive mini mental test or something like that, but just consistent clarity that they understand the decision they're about to make. And 18 years of age, that was what the government decided on, although that varies in other provinces for other decisions. For this reason, it is for this specific instance, it's age 18. And one of the other criteria was that an individual had to have what was defined as a grievous and irremediable medical condition. It's really kind of legal talk, but I'll explain how that was defined in a minute.
We just make sure that everybody has muted their phone. Press *6, please.
One of the other eligibility criteria is that the individual pursuing an assisted death has to make a voluntary request. There can be no coercion whatsoever. It has to be a decision the individual makes for themselves. And the last eligibility criteria is that the person has to be able to give consent after they've received information about the diagnosis, what treatments are available to them, and also they have to have an understanding of what palliative care is and what's available to them. And it's not that they have to accept all those treatments and choices, but the idea is that they have to be informed so that they make an informed decision. So that's a little bit about the eligibility. And so one of the criteria said that a person had to have a grievous and irremediable condition. And so that was further defined with the following points. So a person has to have a serious illness, disease, or disability. So you can see there that an individual does not have to have a terminal illness. So like I said, in different models in Canada, like in the United States with the Oregon model, that you have to have a terminal illness, 6 months, etc. This is very different. So a serious illness, disease, or disability. Next, an advanced state of decline that cannot be reversed. The next is suffering unbearably. Just to mention with the suffering unbearably, that is person-specific. So it is how you as an individual define suffering. And with the assessment forms that are part of the assessment process, I'll speak to that. Individuals are asked by the physician or nurse practitioner, individuals are asked, tell me about your suffering. What does the suffering mean to you? And for each person, it can be different, of course, because we live unique lives and experience the world in different ways. So suffering unbearably. And the last part is grievous and irremediable. It's stated that natural death has to become reasonably foreseeable. And this is where the challenges have come. So when the legislation came into being in 2016, if I was just to do a question with each of you and ask you, what does reasonably foreseeable mean to you? And one of you might say, oh, you know, maybe 6-8 months, I would feel comfortable with that. Another of you might say, well, I think a year would be reasonably foreseeable. And someone else might say, well, 18 months. And this is exactly what happened. Because it was not defined in the legislation, physicians and nurse practitioners across Canada were interpreting it with their comfort level, if you will, because there was no direction. So what happened was an individual might go see a doctor, a nurse practitioner, and say, you know, am I eligible? And they would be told, no, you're not. Another doctor that they would see would say, yes, you are. So this caused inequitable access. And so if you go to the next slide, Janet, so this was a challenge from day one, and it's really just, here we are now, believe it or not, 3.5 years later, and this has just really come to a head. So I'll share a couple of these instances. The law for assisted death in Canada has not changed as I speak to you here today, but different rulings have come about that have changed our understanding. So I'll just talk quickly about this one. A Superior Court in Ontario in June of 2017 said that reasonably foreseeable did not have to be defined. And then we just heard last month, in September, if any of you watched the news, there was a ruling out of Quebec, and it was a young fellow and a young woman. Mr. Trouchon and Guadeau was the two who had taken the case forward out of Quebec, and the superior judge there ruled that reasonably foreseeable was actually cruel and should be struck from the legislation. And she said that should take place in Quebec and also within the federal act. So that has not happened yet, but that was her recommendation, and stated that the government had 6 months to do that. So I'm not sure how that'll play out in Canada in our legislation as we go forward. And at the same time in September, in British Columbia, a young woman on the mainland, Julia Lamb, is living with a type of muscular atrophy illness, and had taken her case through the courts, and a government expert ruled that she indeed would be eligible for an assisted death, given the current understanding of reasonably foreseeable. So the law hasn't changed, but different court rulings and case law have helped inform and shift perception. So I think that's the best I can say.
And if you had to summarize what that shift has been, is it towards extending the period or what's the outcome looking like?
Yeah, thanks. That's such a good question. So in the early days of the legislation, of course, for a physician or an NP to take this on and be the provider, this is a very serious, irreversible act. And to do something that would be interpreted as wrong or an error, the physician or NP could actually go to prison for that. And so everyone was very cautious within that first year. Once that ruling came out, the case of AB out of Ontario, the judge there said there didn't have to be a time period. I'm summarizing, of course. And so physicians started becoming more comfortable with 2, 3, even 4 years versus early days of maybe 12 months. And so what that has meant is that more people living with illnesses with longer trajectories, like, for example, Parkinson's illness, MS, that kind of thing. So persons like that were now being told that they were eligible when maybe originally they were told they weren't. So that's how that shifted.
So longer periods.
Yeah, so it elongated. And I'll just talk, so that's the eligibility criteria, and it's going to shift. We just don't know how that'll play out exactly, and I'm not a legal expert. You're hearing my interpretation as we sit here on a November evening. I'll just talk a little bit. So those are criteria, but the Government of Canada took this very seriously, of course, and so safeguards were put in place too. So if you were talking to a loved one, a friend, etc., the safeguards in place are as follows. And so an individual pursuing this has to put the request in writing. There's a formal piece of paper that you have to complete. You have to have 2 people that are not going to benefit from your death, not inherit, and they also can't be caregivers. They have to actually witness you signing this form to make sure that no one is coercing you in any way. And as I said, a safeguard also is that the person making the request has to be capable of making this decision. And if it ever was that a person was applying or talking to their physician or NP and asked if they're eligible, and if their physician or NP questioned that they really understood, they could ask another healthcare professional, maybe a psychologist, a neurologist, or someone who has this expertise to actually do a capacity assessment. But a huge safeguard is that the person has to be able to give consent. So free will. Another safeguard is 10 days. So if a person fills out the request and it's November the 1st, then starting November 2nd, that would be the beginning of a 10-day waiting period. And the government put that in as a precaution. And the idea is that it was like a cooling off, like a reflection time. So that's really important. Having said that, the legislation also allowed that the 10 days can be waived if the 2 physician NPs involved, if they both agree that it can be waived, and it would be for 2 reasons only. And the 2 reasons would be that death is imminent or loss of capacity is imminent. So those are the 2. I think I kind of talked about the safeguards there. Do people have any questions about the safeguards?
Yeah, really hoping that you will jump into the chat box. Great, thank you guys for asking questions. Oh yeah, so 10 days can be waived if death or loss of capacity are imminent. I think that's what you're asking, Robin. Great. So any other questions, please feel free, and I will bring them to Roseanne's attention if we don't catch them in the moment.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And just so that you know, both of the clinicians doing the 2 assessments would have to agree to those 2 criteria. So if one says, oh yes, I think this is imminent, and the other one says, I don't, they both have to agree to waive the 10 days. And I don't know, again, I apologize if some of this is way too much detail for you, and it's so different. I can't see your faces, and we're not in the same room and whatnot. So
yeah.
We're just doing our
Right. So yeah, ask away any questions.
Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and so I'll go to the next slide, and this is just sharing a little more information with you and just talking about what does the process actually look like. And this might be variable in each province in Canada in terms of the order, but ultimately this is the process that an individual, as I mentioned, has to fill out a request form, and they have to do that. The next thing is that, and I'll just pause there. The request form has to be completed and witnessed. And in the province of British Columbia, the assessment form is available on the Ministry of Health website for assisted dying, so it's available. There's great transparency there, just to let you know. And then an individual who's filled out the request has to have two assessments. So one is someone who will do a first assessment and agree that you meet the criteria, and the second person is the one that would also agree that you're eligible, but actually then be the one to be with you and provide the medication at the time of your choosing. So it's those two assessments that take place. And as I mentioned, there could be a third assessment for capacity. That doesn't happen frequently, but it certainly does happen and is important. And I just wanted to say that just to assure everybody that the process has so much rigor, and that if a family, a friend, a loved one asks you, could you help them get a copy of the request form, that doesn't mean that they're going to complete it or that they just want to look at it. And I find my experience is that a lot of times if a person has the request form and they just read it and look at it, and if they decide, a lot of people have thought about this for a long time, and if they do complete it, it's just, that's what it is, it's just a request. And it often gives people a sense of almost control and almost some relief to know that, okay, I did this. So it doesn't mean that the outcome is a fait accompli. It just means that they are letting their wish be known. And like I said, often there's great relief with that. And when a person goes ahead, first assessment is usually done by a person's primary care provider, like their GP or NP. And if that person says, yes, you're eligible, then they find another doctor or nurse practitioner to take on the prescriber role. And again, you need two of those assessments done, and both have to say that you're eligible. And even then, there's lots of uncertainty, because even if you're eligible and you decide you want to live as long as you possibly can and just set it aside, and often people do, when they're told they're eligible, they'll set that paperwork aside and they'll say, okay, I just want to live as long as I can. And it gives them peace of mind to know that that choice is there. But on the other hand, there's always that concern, because if they wake up one morning and maybe they've had maybe metastases, decreased oxygen, whatever, and their decision-making is impaired, then they've lost the ability to go ahead. So you can see people are caught in a bind there, because there is no advance request for an assisted death.
Can I ask a question? So you've raised a really interesting point, and I sometimes hear this in the calls that I've taken on our support line, where if a caregiver is caring for someone and they're thinking that, the situation is, getting a bit more difficult with the medical situation, so they're contemplating, okay, so I'm going to connect with the palliative care, whatever services are available through their health authority in terms of palliative care. When they make that decision, that doesn't exclude, like what you've just said, I think is really important. People who've made the decision to work with a palliative care team or palliative care services in their health authority. So if they're providing care in the home and the person becomes designated as palliative, this information is another layer. It's a choice in addition to that. Yeah. Thanks for that clarification. And how I describe it to people, I reassure them that just because you are considering or maybe choosing
an assisted death path, palliative care is still available to you right to the end. So you can have both. And this is really, really critical, because what if you were caring for a loved one who chose an assisted death and was thinking that way, and what if all other support said, okay, we're out of here, and then the person, your loved one, lost capacity and was no longer eligible? Or what if when the physician or nurse practitioner comes to the house that day on the planned day, and the first thing they do is they meet with the individual alone and you know, say, do you understand? I am here. I will give you drugs that will end your life. Do you understand? And if the person's lost capacity and cannot give that clear, unequivocal consent, that this will not go ahead. And so you need those support services there with you. So just because you choose assisted death, you still are eligible to all the other services. Absolutely.
And so just in case people don't know, and I'm putting you on the spot, Roseanne, but what would those other services be? Like, what would a palliative care team bring to someone, a caregiver in the home, that provides sort of a backbone or to all of this?
Yeah, no, and that's a great question, because an individual might be talking to their family doctor, nurse practitioner, and be offered palliative care. So say, for example, we often associate palliative care with cancer. That's the origin of palliative care. And now palliative care is understood in the context of many illnesses. So whether it's end-stage heart disease, end-stage lung disease, end-stage liver disease. But it could be a person, say, for example, living with ALS. That's one example, or MS. But maybe you don't think of yourself as palliative in the same way. And so an individual might say, well, I don't want those services, I decline. But if a person accepted them, what it might look like is having a binder in your home with a phone number of someone you can call through the morning, night, 24/7 weekend. So even that phone number is helpful. There's usually in different cities, depending where you are, towns. There are resources available. Like I said, support lines. They can set up services, help access drugs as needed, and the idea is to keep people comfortable,
right,
as long as possible and within their own wishes.
Yeah. So I hope that is helpful for people on the line. We did do a webinar, and it's on our website, on palliative care, and I feel like people need to understand that, you know, these are a range of options. It's a continuum that are available and not exclusive at all. And making yourself aware of what's available in terms of palliative care services is also very important. So if you don't already know that, call our line. We can help you understand what those are. We have materials on our website as well. So, you know, this is within the context of that continuum of care.
Yeah, absolutely. And when the legislation passed in Canada, the government actually wrote into the legislation, this really surprises me, they wrote into the legislation that within a 5-year period, they mandated that a full report had to be done on palliative care services in Canada. And so we're coming up to the 5-year mark, and it would be most horrific if people chose or felt they should choose an assisted death because they could not access palliative care. That is absolutely what no one would ever wish. And yet we know that services for palliative care are different across Canada. Some have more access, robust, others not so much. So, yeah, and of course now there's a whole movement in Canada in terms of palliative care being embedded within all care settings, so a palliative care approach, and so that's really important. But just, yeah, even if you accept a little bit of service and have it there in the background, maybe you don't need the full meal deal kind of thing, but like Janet said, I think it's very wise just to know what's available in your options, and you as always in your life can choose to accept or decline, but just to know what's there and make an informed choice. And
there's a lot of, again, materials that are available online, and I'll put a plug in for Canadian Virtual Hospice. They have some amazing resources on their website. So if, you know, if as Roseanne said, maybe direct services aren't as available, you know, there is information available that might be helpful. So,
yeah. And just I'll segue one little bit here. This is so important. And if your loved one, for example, does follow through and chooses an assisted death, through the hospices, they also offer bereavement service to anybody who, any caregiver, who, any family member, anybody who's lost a loved one. Bereavement services are available, and that extends to losing someone through an assisted death as well. So there are supports. Just please never ever feel alone or isolated, and it's phenomenal that you've got this resource to call at the Caregivers.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and I would just suggest as well that support groups are a huge resource for people who are, have lost a loved one. We welcome people. A lot of the people who attend support groups we know come a long time after the person that they've been caring for has passed, and that's great. And as Roseanne mentioned, there's, I think at Island Health in particular, they've created a support group for people who've lost someone through an assisted death. So, it really is about finding out what's available and trying to take advantage of it.
Yeah.
So we have one comment here: palliative care options make this discussion kind of confusing. Sorry. So, yeah, I if you can say more about what's confusing. So I think what we're trying to say here, and I'll let Roseanne speak to it, but assisted death is one option in the palliative care continuum. So palliative care being providing comfort to someone with.
Yeah, and I might word that a little bit differently. I would say that we are all born and we are all going to die. We know that. So I guess I would talk about a life continuum, and then if we, depending on our life, that end of life continuum, and at your end of life, there are choices. So assisted dying would be one. Choosing palliative care would be another. And I just say that because how people define palliative care can be very nuanced, how people define end of life or end stage illness or advanced illness or serious illness. We get into this whole naming and understanding. So language is really, really important. But yeah.
Does that help? Whoever put that question in there, let us know if we've helped to clarify. And give us a call on our support line, and we'll do our best to make it a bit more clear.
And I just, on this slide, I had one more point, and it's called the plan. So I was telling you about the process. So basically an individual makes a choice, and as I said, Canadians have been very clear. Opinion polls, Canadians definitely support the idea of having an option and control over end-of-life choices. And dignity is the word often associated, the idea of autonomy, choice, dignity. So when a person's told they're eligible, the people I've talked to often making this choice often have clarity. They have a sense of determination, and it's something they'll often say they've thought about for a long time. So once that decision's made, a person doesn't have to act on it. We've had people wait for a year, and I can tell you that everyone choosing assisted death as an option, I would say that none of them wants to die. They just don't want to live with the hand that's been dealt and find the suffering unbearable. And I would say that for most, the suffering that they experience is, because we have such good palliative care and drugs nowadays to control pain, I would say that for most people, the suffering is more existential. They're like I said, they're worried about loss of dignity as they perceive dignity. They're worried about maybe for them that might include losing their bowel function, that kind of thing. It's very personal. It's what's unique for them. And so when people know that they are eligible, what we've seen, it's almost like a living wake, if you will, and we see so many rituals, and people plan. They plan their farewell. They're facing death with their eyes wide open. They might choose to have friends and family over. They might choose music. They might have food. So it's really a celebration that they're present at. And so you can Google, go on to Dying with Dignity. Many websites now. People have told their story and they share it. And I think when the legislation first passed, there was a lot of concern that if a person chose an assisted death, they might not tell anybody. They were worried about stigma. Maybe they were worried about their friend not liking them anymore. But we haven't seen that in Canada. It's almost, I think, in some ways the opposite, where people are wanting to be on the front page and tell their story. And so we're still making sense of that. But for people that want to make this choice, people that meet the criteria, and people that do go ahead, it gives them great peace of mind. And I will say one thing that's unique about the legislation is that if you noticed in everything I've talked about, nowhere does it say that your family has to agree. Nowhere does it say that your spouse, your partner, your son, your daughter, your friends, that they all have to agree. And the truth is they don't. And so, it could be that you live in Calgary and your children live out east, and you have been facing an illness, you're eligible, and you put the process in place. And it could be that you have an assisted death and that you're asking the doctors not to notify your children until after. And so that can happen, and you don't need the permission of your family and friends. And I know that the doctors and nurse practitioners involved spend so much time with an individual and have those conversations, and because they don't want the family left behind to experience harm either, right? But yeah, so we've seen people not tell families because they didn't want to burden them. We've seen them not tell families because they didn't want them to jump on a plane and talk them out of it. We've seen them not tell because they would break down. They wanted to just do it by a letter. They've made a videotape. They've had a palliative team come in and help them do a life memory book and a story. So I think in this work, the biggest thing is just not to have judgment, just to expect the unexpected, just to honor where people are at and what their experience is.
Yeah, boy, that's very interesting. Okay, so the guest that asked about the palliative care option said it sounds like palliative care definition may include assisted living or assisted death, for example, morphine overdose.
No. Palliative care is very clear. Palliative care is a philosophy, and the idea is to support life and decrease pain for as long as possible. Within palliative care, clinicians have options. They want to keep people comfortable, but medication is never given with an intention to end a life. The medication is given for pain relief. And if you're in a situation, you could talk to your you could talk to your palliative care physician about palliative sedation, which is something very different and used in unique situations. But the intention of palliative care is never to give medicine to directly end a life.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that question. That really clarified that point, I think.
And they're great questions too, because it is complex. That's exactly
Right.
what you're touching on. It's not a black and white. It's not. It's very serious and profound. So really great question.
And I didn't as well understand that. I mean, it makes sense about your family and friends not having to agree with you, but as a caregiver, that it introduces a whole other
very different
lens to this.
Yeah.
For sure.
And this slide was just to remind us of the gift that we have of life and light and beauty. So I just put that in to remind me to breathe. And the next slide is just more on federal data. So I don't know if this would interest you, but across Canada, the Government of Canada is collecting reports. And I think in Canada now, we believe around 8,000 people have chosen this option at end of life. And each province, the oversight's different. In some provinces, it's the coroner. In some provinces, it's the Ministry of Health. In British Columbia right now, it has just changed to the Ministry of Health from the coroner. And I would say that the data that's collected in British Columbia, for example, it's fairly similar to data federally, like the male, females about equal. The average age in Canada I believe, is about 72 years of age. On the island, it might be, Vancouver Island, for example, might be a little bit higher in British Columbia overall. But the idea of the data is that it's helping us understand and plan for services and that kind of thing. So that's just what I wanted to say about that. And sorry, just one more thing about data. The federal reports show that most persons choosing an assisted death, in terms of illness, about 60-some% have a cancer diagnosis, and then the next group would be people living with end-stage heart failure, end-stage lung failure, that kind of thing, more organ, and then the next group would be persons with neurological illnesses. Mm-hmm. And so I've spoken to some of this, and most people that choose an assisted death, they prefer to be at home. In most cities, towns, you can actually choose to go into an acute care setting if that makes more sense in your situation or life. Persons can have an assisted death in a long-term care setting where they are and where their home is. And like I said, intravenous is most common. And within all of this, I haven't mentioned it yet, but the legislation built in the concept of conscientious objection. So if you are a healthcare professional, whether you're a nurse, a social worker, a pharmacist, physician, you can, based on religious, moral, ethical beliefs, you can decline to be directly involved, although you would always treat anybody asking you about it with kindness and non-judgment. And also facilities with a religious affiliation can also or have claimed conscientious objection, and I know in Alberta that's been very contentious lately, but certainly we still see that happen in Canada. So conscientious objection of a person is built into the legislation. Conscientious objection of a facility may be something that's challenged. Yeah.
We have a question from Arlette, which is the grieving process generally different for family and friends after the assisted death of a loved one?
Mm-hmm. Well, what a great question. I'm actually involved in a study right now on this very topic, and we're trying to understand it. I think we don't have our data yet, but we're interviewing persons who have lost a loved one, and what my experience is so far, lived experience, is that it's very unique to the individual and situation. So some individuals who choose an assisted death, their family's on board, they're there, they're having a celebration of life, and the family afterwards are so pleased that they were able to honor and support the wish. Other people I've talked to have supported their loved one, been there right to the end, held their hand, and they've done that because they loved one. They loved their loved one, but in their heart of hearts, they struggled with the decision. And others have, a loved one has chosen an assisted death path, and family have stepped away and said, I cannot journey with you. And so I think people have experienced many kinds of deaths, and that often impacts grief. So it depends on the individual, the illness. So I wouldn't say it's black and white at all, but I will say this: we do have a bereavement guide. It's available to anyone in Canada. I've shared it with you, Janet. Mm-hmm. And one thing, it's called a bereavement guide for the patient and family. So yes, the idea is for a person choosing this, it encourages, have conversations, have them early, talk to your loved ones. And often it's the conversation, the telling of the story, or if someone said to you, this is something I'm thinking about, just, maybe it's unexpected for you, but just breathe deeply and just lean in and just tell me more about that. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? Why is this important? Because I think it's the conversation that's the biggest thing. And this next slide, I just tucked it in, it's more data. But it's just to give you an idea too across, like say for example, this is just one province of British Columbia, but in different health authorities, access to assisted death might be different, and more people are choosing in some areas than other, and that could be related to many, many reasons. It could be access, it could be education levels. We know that in Belgium, where assisted death has been there for many years, that if they find persons choosing assisted death have more education, more affluence, that kind
so
of.
this total, 2641 out of 8,000. That's, you know, when we're one province in the whole country, that's pretty interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
You talked about having no advance request for assisted death, and my question is surrounding early stage dementia, and so I'm wanting to know how the whole dementia issue is being handled. I know there's been something in the news about it recently that appeared that someone who had dementia was able to get MAiD. For someone who has early stage, who is capable of making their decisions and rational thought, and they want to plan for their future so that when they get to a certain stage in the disease, they no longer want to continue to live, is that going to be an option?
Yeah, can you go to the next slide, Janet?
Oh.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You've articulated it beautifully. So I was going to talk about current issues, and that's definitely one. So at this point at time in Canada, there definitely, you cannot have an advance request, but you're asking about dementia, and can a person with dementia ever be eligible for an assisted death? And the answer to that would be depends. It depends on the type of dementia. It depends on where a person is in that dementia journey. It depends on so many different variables. So the answer is depends. And yes, you're right. In the media, just in the last week on Michael Enright on the Sunday edition of CBC, there was a documentary, and it's called 10 Minutes to Midnight, and it's the story of Gail Garlick, a gentleman living in British Columbia who did have a diagnosis of Lewy body dementia and still had the capacity to make the decision. So when we went over the eligibility criteria before, it said you can have a disease, disability, etc. So nowhere in the legislation does it say you cannot have a dementia, that if you have a dementia, you are not eligible. It doesn't say that, but you have to meet all the criteria, and so of course the capacity one. And so if you have a chance to listen to the documentary 10 Minutes to Midnight, it's a caregiver, it's the spouse, Barbara, of Gail Garlock, and she tells her story, and it's with a physician involved who, of course, for a physician to agree, the physician's carrying the weight of the criminal code on their shoulders to take this on. But for anyone to see an individual living with dementia and to agree that they are eligible, they would be doing so with great care and rigor. So yes, it depends. Yeah.
Does that answer the question for you?
Not really, in a sense that when a person gets to that point, and I don't know enough about Lewy body to know how that how that compares, but you know, I've had dealings with frontal temporal, and I've had dealings with vascular, and I've had dealings with Alzheimer's, and so I know that when people get to that stage, where for myself personally, if I was at that particular stage, I would not want to continue my life, but I would not have the capacity then to make that rational decision. So that's why I'm looking at it as being an advanced situation where, so it sounds like I wouldn't be able to do that. I want to be able to say, you know, if I am diagnosed with any one of those diseases and I get to the point where I can't provide my own personal care, I don't recognize my loved ones, I'm totally bedridden constantly, whatever, that I don't want to continue living like that because I know what the end is going to be. I've seen it. Pretty soon I won't be able to swallow anymore and all these different things. Why would I want to put myself through that? I would want an assisted death prior to getting there. But when I get to that point, I can't make that capable decision at that time for MAiD. I would have to do it in advance of, and so what I'm hearing is that that's not something that I can plan for.
At this point, with the Canadian law, you definitely cannot have an advance request. But I was referring to the legislation that the ruling that just came out of the Superior Court in Quebec, and the judge specifically in that instance said that when Kay Carter went before the Supreme Court of Canada and we ended up from that with legislation, and the case of Kay Carter, the idea that you had to have a grievous and irremediable condition was there, and then as the bill is debated, the idea that natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable was added. And this is the piece that the Quebec justice said was in violation of the Charter. So if you take out that piece about reasonably foreseeable, that may impact persons with illnesses with longer trajectories that people had assumed weren't eligible before. So I honestly don't know how it'll play out, but I do know that many, many people are watching to see what will happen in the next few months with the federal legislation. But it may be that certainly ideas about advance directives, advance requests, that nuanced language people are wondering. But at this point in time, it is not possible. So if you had an advanced illness, you lost capacity, you have your end-stage Alzheimer's, your caregivers looking after you, they could be your health representative, and they could say, they could make decisions for you, no feeding tube for you, no antibiotics, because they knew what you wanted. So you can do that in advance directive, but assisted dying, no.
Yeah, but that didn't work though and I can't recall the lady's name, but that the lady in Abbotsford that was in a care home and she had been a nurse, and she had told her family when she was diagnosed with dementia that what she did not want, and she did not want to be fed and that sort of thing, and the care home would not go with those wishes, and that was being fought for a very long time in that particular case. They would not abide by her wishes.
Yeah, and it's taking me back to one of the earlier slides I showed you when Sue Rodriguez came out of the courtroom, and she basically said, like, if I can't make this decision, who owns my body? So these are philosophical conversations, and as I said, this is the first time in Canada that this judge has now said that reasonably foreseeable should be struck down and removed. She's given the government, the federal government, 6 months to look at that. So I don't know where it'll lead.
Are there other jurisdictions that we can look at to gain some insight?
Yeah, there are. In Belgium, they do have, for their assisted dying legislation, they do have the possibility of an advance directive, but there are strict criteria. And I'll backtrack a little bit. When the government wrote Canada's assisted dying legislation, the government said there will be within 5 years a palliative care review for Canada, but the government also said within a 2-year period there must be a review done of the age, there must be a review done for advance requests and mental illness. And so the 2 years has obviously passed. And so a review was done on all of these issues. And you can access that if you Google Canadian Council of Academies and Google assisted dying, and you will see all 3 of those reports there with a summary on all 3 of those issues. And so if you want more information, and so part of the summary, it wasn't recommendations, but they gathered the evidence about what's been happening around the world. And so you can read exactly about other jurisdictions and what they have done, and that will help inform Canada. And the idea is that those 3 reports, that the Senate would be acting on those. but we've just had a federal election, and so they've been just kind of sitting there. So now that'll probably go forward. So we're really living in a fluid time, and
what was the name of that Canadian Council?
Canadian Council of Academies. Yeah. So they did their 3 reports. So some people believe that age 18 is arbitrary, to be a mature consenting person for health care shouldn't be age restricted. The idea of advance request consent. And if you were interested in this as well, the whole idea about capacity and different people have put their stories forth. You could Google Audrey Parker, and she basically, there's a petition going around called Audrey's Amendment, and she was a younger woman with metastatic breast cancer, and she felt she had to die a little bit earlier than she would have wanted because she was afraid of losing capacity, and so she said that was cruel as well. And so that brings into the idea, people are teasing apart the difference of advance requests from advance consent. So even if you were eligible for an assisted death, the doctor or nurse practitioner saw you on Friday evening, yes, you want to go ahead, everything is as you had wished, yes, they will come Saturday morning, and if they came Saturday morning and if you couldn't give consent, and the family are saying, but you saw them last night, you know this is what they wanted. The legislation says you must give consent at the moment of. And so people are finding that to be cruel. And so there is some teasing apart between advance request and advance consent. So maybe people imagine maybe advance consent could be within 7 days or something like that, whereas in, like I said, Belgium, an advance request, I think, has a timeline of about 2 years. But
Troy is just saying that those reports are really good.
Yeah,
and
yes, definitely.
And to spark discussion. So that's great.
Yeah, and very, very accessible and very readable. I'll get you to go to the next slide, Janet, because so those are some of the concerns, like I said, current issues, and just other ones I wanted to talk about. Our legislation very uniquely said IV or oral access, and yet in Canada, very few are opting for the oral. And so we're not sure why that is. What we found shifting, we found different associations shifting their positions. Say, for example, the Alzheimer's Society of Canada had originally a position statement on assisted dying, and that shifted with time. Their position now is it's not for them as a society to have a position, but it's more for individuals to decide what's right for them and what's personal to them. So we're seeing shifts in different areas. I talked about conscientious objection by faith-based facilities. That is being contested more and more, and current law is evolving as we go forward. And just go to the next slide too, Janet. Just in terms of the future, so you've already asked about this bereavement support. Do look at the bereavement guide that I shared the link with. Some really good questions if a loved one is thinking about this, that spark really, really deep conversations. And so many experiences, stories, and someone asked, positive experiences, good, bad, very personal, individual, very unique to each person. And so many links. I think I shared one where different people tell their stories. CBC has posted so many stories that are done with real high integrity as well. And I just want to say a couple more things in the future that you might hear of. One would be, for example, to have an assisted death and to have organ donation following that. So that's something that we're seeing. And another, we're seeing in the idea of a MAiD house. Excuse me. So in Saskatoon, they're looking at a MAiD house. I think they've already called it Cider House. So that would be a place, a sacred place for people to choose an assisted death. And in Toronto, they've also fundraised, and they have a house specific to have families come and share ritual. And the next slide is just, so many of these things are evolving, and in some ways things have moved quickly. It's only been 3.5 years, and this was just a story of a couple who had been married for 73 years, and they both had an assisted death. And so some people might think, well, my gosh, they look so well in that picture, but they both had separate physicians doing the assessments, that kind of thing. They both had separate illnesses, and it was very, like I said, done very legally, professionally, and with rigor. And they were interviewed, and on the front of the Globe and Mail, my husband saw that picture, and he just said, but they look so well. And I said, well, if the Globe and Mail came to interview you, and even if you're suffering and not well, you are going to want to look your best. But just the notion, like we haven't even thought about this, that if two people are older, aging together, frail, suffering in some way, what is possible. And so now across Canada, we've had many, many couples that have had an assisted death together. So, not something that we maybe would have anticipated. And just the last slide, what I just wanted to, I'll just read it out here. While the topic is complex, it can be said with certainty, neither those who are strongly supportive nor those who are opposed hold a monopoly on integrity or a genuine concern for the well-being contemplating end of life. And that's from a professor and researcher out of Winnipeg, Manitoba, and he's done a lot of work, Chachanov, in terms of dignity therapy and that kind of thing. So really, really powerful. And I just include that because it's the idea of us all treating everybody kind and honoring their wishes as best we can without judgment. And then the very last slide, you've all been so gracious and patient. Thank you. And so just please, with your loved ones, have conversations. Don't make assumptions. And I would say have conversations early. Don't assume that you've got, many, many tomorrows and years. Life can be unpredictable. So please have conversations. Have them at the kitchen table, the coffee shop. Don't wait till it's too late. So have conversations, and we just strive for a system where we can offer people choice at end of life and end of life care that's the highest quality in Canada. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Roseanne. And I see some people typing. It's great. I hope you have